They said no woman could survive Iron Creek Ranch. 3 had already tried, and 3 had already run. But the 4th one? She didn't just survive. She burned the whole corrupt empire down. When Naomi Mercer arrived with nothing but a worn leather bag and a quiet fire behind her eyes, no one took her seriously. The ranch owner wanted her gone. The town wanted her invisible. And one powerful woman wanted her destroyed. What followed wasn't just a fight for a job. It was a war for dignity, survival, and justice. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end. The stagecoach rattled to a stop just past the iron gate of Iron Creek Ranch, kicking up a thick curtain of rust-colored dust that hung in the October air like something alive. The driver didn't bother climbing down. He simply jerked his chin toward the open land beyond and said, flatly, "End of the line." Naomi Mercer stepped down onto the hard-packed earth with a single worn leather bag in her left hand and a folded letter in her right. She was 24 years old, slender in frame but not in spirit, with dark eyes that moved slowly and deliberately across every detail of her surroundings. The peeling whitewash on the fence posts, the broken hinge on the main gate, the muddy well handle that had clearly not been properly secured in months. She noticed everything. She always did. The coach pulled away behind her without ceremony. She stood alone. The Iron Creek Ranch spread before her in the cold afternoon light, and her first honest impression was this. The place was dying. Not quickly and not completely, but dying in the slow, stubborn way that neglect kills things. The main house was a 2-story structure that had once been handsome, with wide porch columns and a sloped tin roof. But the columns were warped now, the roof patched in 3 places with mismatched materials, and the front steps had rotted almost entirely through on the left side. The bunkhouse behind it stood straighter, but with windows so caked in dust and grease that no light could have passed through them in years. A chicken coop sat tilted at a precarious angle to the right of the main house, its fence mended with rope rather than wire. Beyond the buildings, a large cattle barn loomed in better condition than everything else, clearly the one structure that had received any real attention, because cattle were money, and the rest was just living. Naomi exhaled through her nose, quiet and measured, and walked toward the front porch. Before she reached the steps, the front door swung open. The man who appeared in the doorway was not what she expected, or rather, he was exactly what she expected in the worst possible sense. Silas Boone stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of lean, weathered build that comes from decades of hard physical labor rather than any particular effort at health. He had dark hair gone silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the creek bed nearby, and eyes the color of iron ore, gray with flecks of something darker. He was perhaps 40, possibly 45. His expression, as he looked at her from the doorway, was not hostile. It was something colder than hostility. It was complete and total indifference. He looked her over, once, top to bottom, and then looked past her at the empty road. "You're the woman Fletcher sent for," he said. It wasn't a question. "Naomi Mercer," she replied, her voice clear and unhurried. She held out the folded letter. "From the employment office in Caldwell Springs. I was told you need a housekeeper." Silas didn't take the letter. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "What I need," he said, "is for my foreman to stop making decisions that belong to me." He finally looked at her, directly this time. "I've had 3 women out here in 2 years. First one lasted 6 weeks. Second one lasted 11 days. Third one—" He paused. She left her shoes on the front porch and walked out barefoot in the middle of January. His expression didn't change. "I don't have time to train someone, wait for her to quit, and start over again. So I'll ask you plain. What makes you think you're different?" Naomi held his gaze without blinking. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "That makes a considerable difference." Silence stretched between them. In the distance, a horse stamped and blew air through its nose. Silas Boone studied her for a long moment, his jaw set, his expression impossible to read. Then he stepped aside and opened the door wider. 40 cents a day, he said. Meals provided. You sleep in the small room off the kitchen. Don't touch anything in the study, and don't ask me for conversation. Naomi stepped through the door. The inside of the main house was, if anything, more neglected than the outside. The large front room that should have served as a parlor had been converted into something between a storage space and a second office, with crates of harness leather, coils of rope, and stacks of cattle ledgers crowding out what remained of the original furniture. A horsehair settee sat shoved against one wall, covered in a horse blanket, its legs thick with dust. The kitchen, which she located by following the smell of burnt fat and old ash, was a disaster of a different kind. Every surface was encrusted with the sediment of 100 rushed meals made by men who understood neither cooking nor cleaning. The iron stove had not been properly blackened in what appeared to be years. The water barrel was low and smelled faintly of rust. Naomi set her bag down on the kitchen table, which wobbled badly on its left leg, and she stood very still in the center of the room. She did not feel despair. She felt something closer to the opposite. She felt the particular private satisfaction of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to fix things that had been broken by other people's carelessness. She rolled up her sleeves. She started with the stove. By the time the ranch hands came in for supper that first evening, the kitchen had undergone a visible transformation. The stove had been properly blacked and stoked with fresh wood. The table had been stabilized with a folded leather strip under the short leg. The water barrel had been scrubbed, refilled from the well with 2 hard trips made in the last of the afternoon light, and covered with a cloth to keep dust out. On the stove, a large iron pot held a proper venison stew, made from the half-dried cut of venison she'd found hanging in the back larder, combined with dried beans, wild onion, and the only spices she'd been able to locate: salt, pepper, and a jar of dried thyme that had been pushed to the back of a shelf so long it had been forgotten. 5 ranch hands filed through the kitchen door, moving with the automatic wariness of men who had been disappointed by cooking before. They were a varied group: one older, barrel-chested man with a white beard named Clem, 2 younger men in their early 20s, brothers named Perry and Dutch, a lean, sun-scorched man of perhaps 35 who wore his hat indoors and said almost nothing, going by the name Rook, and the foreman, a straight-backed man of 50 named Fletcher Holt, who had been the one to send for her from Caldwell Springs. Fletcher nodded at Naomi when he came in and said simply, "Glad you made it." The others said nothing. Perry and Dutch exchanged a glance. Clem sat down heavily in his chair and looked at the pot on the stove with an expression that suggested he was reserving judgment. Naomi ladled the stew into bowls without ceremony and set them down the table. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 5 men eating something unexpectedly good. It was not the silence of politeness. It was the silence of attention. Clem reached the bottom of his bowl, looked up at nothing in particular, and said, It was, Naomi would understand later, the highest compliment he had ever offered anyone in connection with food. No one asked for her name. No one asked anything at all. She cleaned the pot, washed the bowls in the basin behind the kitchen, and went to her room off the kitchen, which was 6 feet wide, 9 feet long, with a cot, a small window, a peg for her coat, and nothing else, and slept the immediate, dreamless sleep of someone who had used every part of themselves that day. The days that followed were hard in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. The physical labor Naomi could manage. She rose before first light each morning, had coffee ready, and biscuits in the Dutch oven before the men came in, managed 3 meals a day from a kitchen that had no organized pantry, no consistent supply schedule, and recurring shortages of basic staples that she had to work around with whatever ingenuity she had available. She repaired things. She cleaned things. She organized the chaos of the house with the systematic patience of someone who found disorder genuinely offensive. She scrubbed the parlor floor on her hands and knees on the 4th day and moved the crates of harness leather into the equipment shed where they belonged. She mended the curtains in the front room on the 6th day, using the needle and thread from her own bag. On the 8th day, she found that the root cellar beneath the house had not been properly inventoried in at least a season, located several canned goods that were still good, and reorganized the entire space so that it could be used efficiently. On the 12th day, she climbed onto the roof herself, using the ladder from the barn, which she had to drag 30 yards through mud after a rain, and cleared the debris from the guttering, which had been causing water to pool against the north foundation. She did none of these things for appreciation. She did them because they needed doing, and she was there, and she was capable. But the hard thing, the thing that required a different kind of endurance, was the silence of the men around her. Not unfriendly silence, precisely, It was the careful, watchful quiet of people who had been burned before and were not willing to invest in something they expected to disappear. Every morning, they ate what she made and left without comment. Every evening, they came back, ate again, and left again. Rook had not spoken a single word to her directly in 2 weeks. Dutch had said, "Pass the salt," on day 9 and seemed to consider that a significant social interaction. Only Fletcher, the foreman, spoke to her with any regularity. "Silas doesn't mean anything by it," he told her one afternoon, pausing by the kitchen doorway while she was repairing a split in one of the kitchen chairs. "He's not cruel. He's just—" Fletcher searched for the word. "Sealed up. Like a jar somebody tightened too hard. What happened to his wife took something out of him, and he never put it back." Naomi continued working the chair joint without looking up. "I'm not here to put anything back," she said quietly. "I'm here to do a job." Fletcher looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite name, not pity, but a cautious kind of respect. Then he nodded and moved on. She didn't ask about the wife. Not then. Not for a long time. The first significant moment came at the end of her 3rd week, and it came from the direction she least expected. She had gone to the barn early one morning, earlier than usual, before 5, because she'd heard one of the horses making a distressed sound in the night and wanted to check on it before starting breakfast. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and manure and the specific warm animal comfort of horses at rest. She moved down the row of stalls until she found the source of the sound, a young mare in the second-to-last stall, gray with a white star, who was standing at an awkward angle with her left foreleg raised. Naomi opened the stall gate and moved carefully into the space, speaking in a low, even tone. No particular words, just the steady cadence of a voice that meant no harm. She ran her hand down the horse's neck, felt the fine tremble of pain in the muscles, and then crouched and examined the foreleg carefully. There was a stone wedged deep in the frog of the left hoof, pressed in hard enough that it had started to cause bruising. Nothing she couldn't address. She drew the small folding knife she kept on her person, braced the hoof against her knee, and worked the stone out with careful, deliberate pressure. The mare exhaled with the sound like deep relief and shifted her weight immediately onto the freed leg. "Good girl," Naomi murmured. "Who taught you that?" The voice behind her made her flinch. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She rose and turned to find Silas Boone standing just inside the barn door, still in the wool shirt he'd worn at supper the night before, suggesting he hadn't yet slept, or had risen as early as she had. He was looking not at her face, but at the horse, who had lowered her head to nose at Naomi's shoulder in the specific, trusting way of an animal who has just been helped. "My father," Naomi said, turning back to run her hand once more along the mare's foreleg, checking for residual heat. "He kept horses. He wasn't much good at other things, but horses he understood." A pause. "Her name's Comet," Silas said. His voice was different in here, not warm, but less guarded. The way voices sometimes change in the presence of animals. "She's been favoring that leg for 2 days. I was going to look at it this morning." "You might have lost another day," Naomi said, straightforward, not unkind. The stone was in deep. Another silence. Then Silas moved past her, opened the stall door wider, and stood beside the mare, running his own hand along her neck. He didn't look at Naomi, but when he spoke, there was something different in the tone. "Breakfast at 6, he said. Not 5:30, 6. She almost asked why. She didn't. She simply nodded. "6 it is," she said, and left him there with his horse. It was, she would understand later, his version of thank you. By the end of the 5th week, something had shifted on the ranch in the way that weather shifts. Not with a single dramatic event, but with a gradual change in pressure that everyone feels before they can name it. Perry had started holding the door when she carried heavy loads. Dutch had, without being asked, repaired the broken fence around the chicken coop after she mentioned, to no one in particular, that the gaps were large enough for a fox. Clem had taken to sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoons with his coffee, not speaking much, but simply being present, in the manner of a large, amiable dog that has decided you are part of the household. Rook, silent, weathered, inscrutably private Rook, had appeared one morning beside the well with a replacement handle for the pump, without explanation or comment, installed it in 10 minutes, and walked away without acknowledging that he'd done it. And the meals had become something different. Not just food. The table had become a place where the ranch hands actually sat, actually settled, actually lingered a moment longer than hunger required. Naomi had begun to learn their particular preferences without asking. Clem wanted his coffee black and hot and frequent. Dutch needed more salt than anyone else at the table. Perry was partial to anything sweet and would eat stewed dried fruit with an almost embarrassing enthusiasm. Rook would eat anything placed in front of him without comment, but always finished everything, which he had learned to read as the highest form of approval he was capable of expressing. She adjusted. She remembered. She provided. None of this was manipulation. It was the practice of attention, of seeing people clearly and responding to what they actually were rather than what was convenient to assume. It was the same skill she had used her entire life, in circumstances far less forgiving than this one. Fletcher noticed. Of course Fletcher noticed. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" he said one evening. Not a question. Naomi was folding the week's laundered clothes at the kitchen table. "I'm doing my job," she said. "I mean more than that." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with that same careful respect she'd seen before. "You came in here and these men were like—" He shook his head. "Like iron that's cooled wrong. All hard in the wrong places. And you haven't pushed a single one of them. You haven't demanded anything. You've just—" He searched again for the word. "You've just been here, solid, every single day." Naomi folded a shirt and set it aside. "That's what a person does," she said. "Not everyone," Fletcher said quietly. "Not the other three." She didn't respond to that, but after he'd gone, she sat for a moment in the kitchen with her hands still, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something tentative and fragile that she refused to name too quickly for fear that naming it would break it. It felt like belonging. It was on a Saturday in early November that the outside world intruded for the first time. Naomi had gone into the small settlement of Harlow Creek, the nearest town, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings centered around a general store, a post office, a feed store, and a saloon, to collect the weekly supply order that Fletcher had arranged through the general store's owner, a round-faced man named Gerald Tibbs who smelled of tobacco and was reliably kind in the transactional way of people who want your business. She was on her way out of the store with a loaded crate when she heard her name. Or rather, she heard a description of herself, which was worse. Two women stood on the raised wooden boardwalk across the narrow street, making no particular effort to lower their voices. One was middle-aged and heavy-set, in a good wool coat. The other was younger, with careful hair and the specific expression of someone who does not form her own opinions. "That woman from Iron Creek," the older one was saying. "Fletcher Holt sent all the way to Caldwell Springs for her. A housekeeper." The word was layered with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was doing its best to achieve it. "Can you imagine what the situation must be out there that a man needs to send away for company?" "I heard she has no family," the younger woman offered. "Of course she has no family. Women who take positions like that don't have family. They have circumstances." The older woman's eyes found Naomi across the street with the practiced accuracy of someone who had been watching from the moment she stepped out of the store. She held the look for a moment, not aggressive, but measured, assessing. "She won't last," she said, turning away. "They never do." Naomi stood on the street with the crate in her arms and let the words pass through her the way she had learned, over many years, to let such words pass, not absorbing them, not fighting them, simply letting them find no purchase and fall away. She loaded the crate into the back of the supply wagon. She climbed up onto the seat. She drove back toward Iron Creek Ranch without looking back at the boardwalk. But she had noticed, and filed carefully away for later consideration, that the older woman's coat had been very fine, very expensive, and that even from across a narrow dirt street, the rings on her left hand had caught the November light like small declarations of power. She asked Fletcher about it that evening, casually, while he was drinking his after-supper coffee. "Woman in town," she said, "older, fine wool coat, rings on both hands, watching me from across the street like she was counting something." Fletcher's expression changed. Not dramatically, but in the particular way of a man who recognizes something he was hoping wouldn't arrive. "That," he said, setting down his coffee cup carefully, "would be Evelyn Ashcroft." He said nothing more for a moment. The silence in the kitchen stretched. Who is she? Naomi asked. Fletcher looked at her. She owns the Ashcroft Land Company, he said. 6,000 acres to the north and east. She's been trying to buy Iron Creek for 3 years. He paused. Silas won't sell. Won't even discuss it. They have... He chose his words with visible care. A history of disagreement. Naomi turned this over in her mind. And she was watching me, Naomi said. Yes, Fletcher said quietly. She was. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Naomi thought about the fine coat, the careful rings, the measuring look. She thought about the tone of those words across the street. She won't last. They never do. Not prediction, not observation. A decision. She picked up her dish towel and went back to the evening work, her face composed and calm. But behind her dark eyes, something had shifted and settled into place like a key turning in a lock. She was being watched. She was being judged. And someone powerful, for reasons she didn't yet fully understand, wanted her gone. On the morning of her 42nd day at Iron Creek Ranch, Silas Boone came into the kitchen at 5:50 and poured his own coffee for the first time. He stood at the stove, cup in hand, and looked out the window at the gray pre-dawn light falling across the yard. He didn't speak. Naomi was at the work table, rolling biscuit dough, and she didn't speak either. They stood in the kitchen in that early silence together, and it was, in its own quiet, unannounced way, a kind of peace. After a long moment, Silas said, without turning from the window, "The roof on the south side of the bunkhouse is going to need work before hard winter. I'll need the men on the cattle rotation this week. It'll have to wait." "I can do it," Naomi said, not looking up from the dough. Silas turned and looked at her. "It's a full roof repair," he said. 3 sections of tin to be replaced, flashing to be reseated. It's not... "I know what it is," she said calmly. "I've done it before. Show me where the replacement tin is stored, and I'll have it done in 2 days." A silence. His iron-gray eyes moved over her face with the same searching quality she had first seen in them on the day she arrived, but it was different now. Less indifferent. Something more like genuine curiosity about a thing he hadn't expected to find. "Why?" he said. And it was an honest question, without the antagonism that had sharpened the same word in those first days. Naomi met his eyes directly. "Because it needs doing," she said. "And I'm here." Silas Boone looked at her for another long moment. Then he set his coffee cup down and walked to the kitchen door. "Tin's in the equipment shed," he said. "Back left corner. There's a good hammer on the center workbench. Don't use the other one. The handle's split." He pushed through the door into the cold morning. Naomi watched the door swing closed behind him. Then she turned back to her biscuits, and if there was something very close to a smile at the corner of her mouth, there was no one there to see it. She pressed the cutter into the dough, again and again, perfectly even, perfectly steady. Outside, Iron Creek Ranch breathed in the early morning cold. And in the distance, far to the north and east across 6,000 acres of Ashcroft land, someone was making a very different kind of calculation. The bunkhouse roof took Naomi a day and a half. She was up on it before sunrise on the first morning, moving across the pitched tin surface with the careful, deliberate balance of someone who had learned early that falling was a luxury she could not afford. The replacement tin panels were heavy and awkward to maneuver alone, and the flashing around the chimney pipe had rusted through in 2 places she hadn't anticipated from the ground. She worked through the cold with her hands reddening in the November air, driving nails in clean, even lines, reseating the flashing with the patience of a woman who understood that a job done halfway was worse than a job not started. Perry found her up there at mid-morning on the second day and stood below for a long moment, shielding his eyes against the pale winter sun, before he climbed up without a word and held the panels in place while she drove the last of the nails. He didn't offer explanation or seek thanks. He simply made the work go faster. When she climbed down and looked back up at the finished roof, solid, weather-tight, done, she felt the quiet satisfaction that only comes from work completed with your own hands. Perry looked up at it too, then looked at her sideways with something she had begun to recognize as his version of respect. 3 sections, he said. Day and a half. The flashing took longer than I expected, she said. Still, Perry said, and walked away. By the time Silas saw the roof that evening, he stood outside the bunkhouse for a full minute in the fading light, looking up at it without speaking. He didn't say anything to Naomi directly, but that night at supper, he passed her the bread without being asked, which was, she had learned, a significant gesture from a man who operated primarily in the language of small, unannounced actions. The weeks that followed deepened the rhythm of the ranch in a way that felt, for the first time, like something sustainable. The kitchen was now a functioning system rather than a daily improvisation. The root cellar was organized, inventoried, and stocked against winter. The parlor had been reclaimed from its chaos and restored to something approaching its original purpose. A room where a person could actually sit, where the air no longer smelled of neglect and rope leather. Naomi had found, in a trunk beneath the stairs, a set of curtains that must have belonged to a previous era of the house. Good linen, badly in need of washing, but intact. And she had cleaned and rehung them at the parlor windows, and the room had changed completely in the afternoon light that now came through clean glass onto clean floors. She did not ask permission for any of this. She simply did it, and then it was done, and it was better. Silas walked through the parlor one Sunday morning and stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking at the curtains, at the swept floor, at the furniture arranged back into its proper configuration. His expression moved through something she couldn't fully read, a shadow of something old and private crossing his face, and then he walked on without speaking. Fletcher told her afterward, quietly, that the curtains had belonged to Silas's wife. Naomi absorbed this and said nothing. She made a note to herself to be more careful, not to remove the curtains, that would be its own form of erasure, but to be careful, to understand that she was moving through a space that held grief she hadn't been told about, and might not be told about for a very long time. She let the curtains stay. She kept the floor clean. She understood that some things required patience measured not in weeks but in seasons. It was in this period of fragile, growing stability that Evelyn Ashcroft made her first move. It came in the form of a supply shortage so mundane that it took Naomi 2 weeks to recognize it as deliberate. The first time the flour order came up short, she assumed it was a mistake at the general store. She adjusted, stretched the existing supply, made smaller batches, substituted cornmeal where she could. The second time, the shortage was in salt and dried beans simultaneously, which was harder to explain as coincidence and harder to work around. She said nothing to Fletcher or Silas. She managed. The third time, the order arrived not just incomplete but wrong. The wrong cuts of preserved meat, the wrong grade of coffee, half the staples missing and replaced with items she hadn't ordered and couldn't use. She stood in the kitchen looking at the crate from the Harlow Creek General Store and felt the first cold current of understanding move through her. She drove into town the next morning herself, rather than waiting for the weekly supply run. Gerald Tibbs, the store owner, met her at the counter with the look of a man who knows he is guilty of something but hopes it won't be named directly. The order was wrong, Naomi said. Simple, factual. There were supply issues, he started, coming out of... Mr. Tibbs, she kept her voice even. I've been placing the same order for 2 months. The same items, the same quantities, from the same suppliers you've been using for years. This is the third consecutive week with significant discrepancies. She placed her hands flat on the counter. What changed? Tibbs looked at his hands, then at the door, then back at her. The specific geography of a man who is embarrassed but also frightened. Mrs. Ashcroft does a significant amount of business with this store, he said, finally and quietly. She has expressed opinions about Iron Creek Ranch. Naomi looked at him steadily for a long moment. I see, she said. I don't mean to cause trouble, Tibbs said, and she almost believed him. Then fill my order correctly, she said. All of it. Today. He did. She loaded it herself and drove back to the ranch in the cold, her face composed and her mind working. The supply interference was small, petty even, but it had a shape to it that she recognized. It was the opening movement of something larger, a test of patience, of endurance, of whether she could be worn down by accumulated inconvenience before the real pressure arrived. She reported none of it to Silas. Not yet. She needed to understand the full shape of the thing before she could speak to it with any authority. But the full shape of it arrived sooner than she anticipated, and it arrived through a channel she had not expected. She was in Harlow Creek on a Friday morning in late November, collecting mail from the post office, when she became aware that something had changed in the way the town looked at her. It was subtle, a slight withdrawal when she passed, conversations that paused at her approach and resumed at her departure, the particular social temperature of a community in which a certain version of a story has begun to circulate. She had felt this before, in other places, at other times in her life, and she recognized it the way you recognize weather. Not by seeing the storm, but by feeling the air change. In the dry goods section of the general store, while she waited for Tibbs to finish with another customer, she overheard enough to understand what the story was. Two women at the fabric counter, voices comfortably low. Staying out there alone with all those men, no proper arrangement, and people are saying she and Boone have an understanding, if you take my meaning. And then, most precisely, most deliberately, Evelyn says a woman like that, with no family, no references anyone can verify. She could be anyone. Naomi stood very still in the dry goods aisle with a spool of thread in her hand. She counted to 4. She set the thread down and walked to the post office window with her back straight and her face absolutely composed, collected the mail, and walked out of the store without purchasing anything else. She sat in the supply wagon on the main street of Harlow Creek for 2 minutes, long enough to let the particular heat of the moment pass through her without making any decisions she would regret. Then she drove home. That evening, after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, she went to Fletcher's office, a small room off the barn he used for paperwork, and knocked. "Come in," he said. She sat down across from his desk. She told him everything. The supply irregularities, the conversation with Tibbs, what she'd overheard in the store. She told it plainly and without drama, in the order it had happened, leaving nothing out. Fletcher listened with his hands folded on the desk and his expression growing progressively darker, the way clouds build before a summer storm, slowly, then all at once. When she finished, there was a silence. "She's going after your reputation," Fletcher said. "It's what she does. She did it to the family that owned the Henderson parcel 3 years ago. Rumors, social pressure, the wife couldn't stand it, and they sold inside of 6 months." "I know," Naomi said. "I expected something like this. What I didn't expect was how fast." "That means you scared her." Fletcher looked at her directly. "Evelyn Ashcroft doesn't move quickly unless something has caught her attention." He paused. "You've been here barely 3 months. You've transformed this ranch in ways that—" He stopped, started again. "Silas looks different. The men are different. The whole place has a different weight to it." He shook his head slowly. "She can see it, and she knows what it means." "What does it mean?" Naomi asked, though she had her own answer and wanted to hear his. "It means Iron Creek is getting stronger," Fletcher said, "and she doesn't want that." Naomi nodded slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap. "Then we need to tell Silas," she said. "Yes," said Fletcher. "We do." They told him that night. Silas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and listened to everything Fletcher and Naomi laid out between them. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly until the very end, when Naomi described what Tibbs had told her in the store, that Evelyn's influence over the town's commerce had been weaponized to interfere with the ranch's supply chain. Then something moved across his face. Not surprise, not anger exactly. Something older than anger. The expression of a man who has been fighting the same enemy for a long time and has just received confirmation that the fight is not over. "She's been trying to take this ranch for 3 years, Silas said, his voice flat and hard. "She bought out the Morrow place to the north, the Deacon parcel to the east. Iron Creek is the only thing left between her land and the river access she wants." He looked at the table. "I told her 3 times I wouldn't sell. The last time she came out here personally to make the offer, I told her she could buy every other piece of land in the territory, and this place would still not be for sale as long as I'm breathing." "What did she say?" Naomi asked. Silas looked up at her. His iron gray eyes were very steady. She said, "Then I suppose we'll see how long that lasts." The kitchen was very quiet. "She's going to escalate," Naomi said. Not a question. "Yes," Silas said. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "And we need to think about what we can do to limit her leverage before she does." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a window opens when the pressure inside and outside a room finally equalizes. He had looked at her this way a handful of times before, in the barn with Comet, on the morning of the biscuit dough, on the evening she told him she would repair the bunkhouse roof, each time with the same quality of attention, as though he were revising something. "What are you thinking?" he said. Naomi had been thinking about it for the entire drive back from Harlow Creek, and through supper, and through the dishwashing, and through the walk across the yard to Fletcher's office, and she said it now with the calm of someone who has already made peace with the decision before they speak it aloud. "Evelyn Ashcroft's leverage over this town runs on social propriety," she said. "The rumors she's spreading about my presence here, about what I am and am not to this ranch, they only work if there's genuine ambiguity to exploit. She needs people to be uncertain about what I am." She paused. "Marry me. Formally, legally, on record. A marriage of convenience. It removes every piece of social ammunition she has. It legitimizes my position here completely, and it makes any further rumors about impropriety look exactly like what they are, manufactured." The silence this time was different in quality. Fletcher had gone very still. Silas looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not surprised exactly, because she suspected very little genuinely surprised this man, but something close to it, a reckoning. "That's a significant proposal," he said quietly. "I know it is," she said. "I'm not proposing anything other than a legal arrangement, a partnership, defined terms. No obligations on either side beyond what we've already established." She met his eyes without wavering. "But it shuts the door on her. Completely." Fletcher looked at Silas. Silas looked at Naomi. The oil lamp on the table cast everything in warm gold and deep shadow. "Give me a day," Silas said. He gave it one day and one night, and on the following morning at breakfast, with the rest of the hands at the table and the winter light coming through the clean parlor curtains and the smell of coffee and biscuits in the air, he said, without preamble, "Naomi and I are getting married. Legal arrangement. Registered in Harlow Creek before the month's end." He looked around the table with an expression that invited neither comment nor celebration. "The ranch business doesn't change. Carry on." There was a silence of approximately 3 seconds. Then Clem reached for another biscuit and said, "About time somebody here made a sensible decision." Perry and Dutch exchanged a look. Dutch's mouth twitched at the corner. Rook, at the far end of the table, did not look up from his coffee, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted. And Naomi had learned enough about Rook by now to understand that this was, for him, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Fletcher caught Naomi's eye across the table. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They were married on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of November, in the office of Judge Harold Prentice in Harlow Creek, with Fletcher as witness and the judge's elderly clerk as a second. The ceremony took 11 minutes. There was no reception, no celebration, no announcement beyond the legal registration. Naomi wore her good dress, the dark blue wool one she'd brought in her leather bag, and Silas wore the same clothes he wore to check fence line, which she found, privately, appropriate. They signed their names on the document, shook the judge's hand, and walked out into the cold December air as a married couple in every legal sense of the word. On the walk back to the supply wagon, they did not touch. They walked side by side in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Thank you," Silas said after a moment. "Thank you," Naomi returned. That was all. They drove back to Iron Creek Ranch through the winter afternoon, and Naomi made supper, and the evening proceeded exactly as every other evening had proceeded, and the only difference was the entry in the judge's ledger and whatever was registered in the particular private interior of two people who were not yet sure what they had begun. The news reached Evelyn Ashcroft within 48 hours. Naomi knew this because the supply order the following week was perfectly correct for the first time in months. Every item, every quantity, exact. And Tibbs met her at the counter with the expression of a man who has received instructions to reverse course and is profoundly relieved to do so. Social ammunition neutralized. Supply interference ended. For approximately 2 weeks, Naomi allowed herself to believe that the battle had been won before it had fully begun. Then the fences came down. The first break was discovered on a Monday morning, a full 40-foot section of the north pasture fence, the posts pulled clean from the ground rather than broken, which meant it hadn't been an accident and it hadn't been weather. 14 head of cattle had drifted through the gap overnight. It took Perry, Dutch, and Rook the better part of a day to locate and return them all, during which time no other work got done, which was the point. The second break came 6 days later, on the east boundary. This time 20 posts were down, and 3 of the cattle they recovered had been driven hard enough to be lame, which was both cruelty and a financial loss. Silas stood at the second break with Fletcher and Naomi, looking at the pulled posts and the cattle tracks that ran in the wrong direction, away from the ranch rather than toward the road, and his jaw was set in the way she had learned meant he was containing something very large very carefully. "This is organized," Fletcher said. "Yes," said Silas. "2 men minimum," Rook said from behind them, and they all turned because Rook speaking unsolicited was an event. He was crouched by one of the pulled post holes, examining the ground. "See how the earth breaks around the pulse? 2 different angles, 2 different sets of hands." He stood. His face was expressionless. "And they knew where our night watch rotates. They knew the gap in coverage." The implication settled over all of them. "Someone gave them our schedule," Silas said. "Or someone watched us long enough to learn it," Naomi said quietly. Silas looked at her. She held his gaze. "We changed the rotation," she said. "Starting tonight. Fletcher assigns it, tells no one outside this group until an hour before. Vary the timing, cover the east and north boundaries simultaneously if we can." She paused. "And we document everything, every break, every loss, every date and time. Written down, witnessed, kept somewhere safe." Silas looked at her for that long revising moment again. "Why documented?" "Because this is going to court eventually," Naomi said. "And when it does, we need to have been building a record from the beginning." The third incident was not a fence. It was the cattle themselves. 8 head from the south pasture found with their brands altered, the ironwork crude but sufficient to muddy ownership, discovered only because Rook had memorized the earmarkings of every animal on the property and flagged the discrepancy immediately. It was the kind of interference that, in a territory dispute, could take months of legal wrangling to untangle even with irrefutable documentation. Without documentation, it could cost the ranch those animals permanently. They documented it. Naomi wrote it down in a ledger she kept locked in the chest in her room. Dates, descriptions, witnesses, estimated losses. The record grew. In town, the social pressures shifted form. The rumors about Naomi's character had been neutralized by the marriage, but they were replaced by a different category of whisper, about the ranch's financial stability, about Silas Boone's judgment, about whether Iron Creek could survive another bad winter, about whether any sensible rancher would trust the operation long enough to do business with them. Supply merchants who had previously been neutral began delaying deliveries. The feed stores started requiring payment in advance rather than extending the 30-day credit they'd provided for years. Small, accumulated pressures, each individually dismissible, collectively forming a kind of siege. Naomi absorbed all of it. She tracked it, recorded it, and continued running the ranch's interior with the same unbroken steadiness that had defined her from the first day. She did not allow the siege to reach the kitchen, or the parlor, or the table where the hands ate their 3 meals a day. Whatever happened outside the walls of Iron Creek, inside those walls there was warmth and order and food, and the particular stability of a woman who refused, regardless of external pressure, to be destabilized. But the cost of carrying it was real, and there were evenings, after supper, after the hands had gone, after the kitchen was clean and the lamp was turned low, when she sat at the kitchen table and felt the full weight of it in her chest. The loneliness of being the person who holds everything together. The particular exhaustion of endurance without relief. It was on one such evening, in the dead of January, that Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the look of a man who had been working something over in his mind for a long time and had finally reached a resolution he hadn't been looking for. He sat down across from her at the table without being invited, which was new. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I know it's not what you signed for," he said. "Any of this. The fences, the harassment in town, the—" He stopped. His voice had a roughness in it that wasn't its usual texture. "This isn't a fair thing I've put you in the middle of." "You didn't put me anywhere," Naomi said, her voice quiet and even. "I made a decision with full information. I don't regret it." He looked at her in the lamplight. "Why not?" he asked. And it was the same honest question he'd asked her in the barn about Comet. The same quality of genuine wanting to understand. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because this place deserves to survive." And because she stopped, reconsidered, tried again. Because I've spent most of my life in places where I was temporary, where I was tolerated until I wasn't convenient. And this is the first place in a long time where I feel like I'm part of something that's worth protecting. Silas looked at her for a very long moment. His iron gray eyes in the lamplight were not hard the way they had been on the first day. They were something else entirely, a quality she had no exact name for, but that she felt in the same part of herself that had felt the fragile, unnamed thing during her 5th week on the ranch. "It is worth protecting," he said, finally and quietly. Taut. He stood up from the table and went back through the door into the dark hallway, and Naomi sat alone in the kitchen with the oil lamp burning low and the cold pressing against the clean windows, and the whole vast, threatened, stubborn, surviving enterprise of Iron Creek Ranch holding itself together around her. Outside, the January wind moved across the frozen prairie with the sound of something that has not yet decided what it will become. And somewhere to the north, in a large house on 6,000 acres of Ashcroft land, a woman with very fine rings on her hands was deciding that inconvenience was no longer sufficient. It was time for something worse. The first cattle disappeared on a Thursday in the middle of February, and by the time anyone understood what had happened, the trail was 2 days cold. 16 head from this east pasture, gone between the evening check and the morning count, pulled through a section of fence that had been cut clean rather than pulled, which was a different signature from the earlier fence breaks, and meant either a different hand or an escalation in method. Rook followed the tracks east for 4 miles before they scattered across a section of frozen creek bed where no hoof print would hold, and he came back to the ranch at dusk with the look of a man who has encountered something deliberate and patient and thoroughly planned. "They knew the creek would cover them," he said to Silas and Fletcher in the barn. "They drove the cattle to it on purpose. Whoever did this knew this land." Silas stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular way and said nothing. The financial blow was significant. 16 head was not ruinous on its own, but it came on top of the altered brands in January, the delayed feed deliveries that had forced early pasture rotation, and the veterinary costs from the cattle that had been driven lame in the fence breaks. The ranch's operating margin, never generous in winter, was compressing in a way that Fletcher tracked in his ledger with growing lines of worry across his forehead. Naomi saw the numbers. She didn't ask to see them. Fletcher showed her, because she had become, in practice if not in any official title, the person on this ranch who understood the full picture most clearly. She sat in his small office off the barn and looked at the columns of figures and understood that Evelyn Ashcroft had stopped playing a long game. She was accelerating. "We need to move the remaining herd to the north pasture," Naomi said. "All of it. Consolidate and watch 1 perimeter instead of 3. "That crowds the grazing," Fletcher said. "For 6 weeks, maybe 8. Until we can establish who's doing this and stop them." She looked up from the ledger. "A crowded pasture we can defend is better than spread range we can't." Fletcher looked at her the way he had looked at her so many times in the preceding months, with the expression of a man who had been right about something before he'd known what it was. He nodded and went to find Silas. They consolidated this herd over 2 days in bitter cold, and Naomi organized a nightly watch rotation that kept 2 armed men on the north pasture perimeter at all times. The schedule varied and unpredictable. She kept the rotation records in her own hand in the ledger that lived in the locked chest in her room, which was now also where she kept Fletcher's financial records, copied in her careful hand, along with every documented incident going back to November. The stolen cattle did not recur. For 3 weeks, the north pasture held, the perimeter held, and Naomi began to wonder if the consolidation had been enough of a deterrent to force a change of approach. She was wrong. The approach had already changed. It was simply coming from a direction she hadn't thought to watch. It was Clem who brought her the first piece of it, on a Sunday afternoon in early March. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound discomfort. Clem, who had the emotional transparency of bedrock, was visibly unhappy about what he was carrying. "Sit down, Clem," she said, reading him at a glance. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands twice. "I heard something in town yesterday," he said. "At the saloon. I wasn't eavesdropping, but—" He stopped. "There's a man. Calls himself Decker. Been in Harlow Creek about 3 weeks. Staying at the boarding house. Asking questions about Iron Creek, about the layout of the property, the fencing, where the barn sits in relation to the house." He looked up at her. "He's not a rancher. He doesn't ask rancher questions. He asks the questions a man asks when he wants to know how a place is built and where things can burn. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Naomi was very still for a moment. Did he say who he was working for? Not directly, Clem said. But he was buying drinks with Ashcroft money. I recognized the man who introduced them. Name of Garrett. He manages the north section of Ashcroft land. He was there with Decker 2 nights in a row. Naomi set down the bowl she had been holding and looked out the kitchen window at the barn. The big cattle barn, the only structure on this property that had consistently received proper maintenance, full of horses, full of hay laid in for winter, full of everything that Iron Creek depended on. Thank you, Clem, she said, her voice steady as still water over the cold thing moving beneath it. She told Silas and Fletcher that evening, and the moment she said the word burn, she saw Silas's expression change in a way she had never seen it change before. Not the controlled containment of anger she had seen over the fence breaks and the stolen cattle. Something rawer, something that had its roots in a part of him she hadn't been allowed to see. She wouldn't, Fletcher said, but his voice had doubt in it. She's been moving in one direction for 4 months, Naomi said. Each step has been larger than the last. She's not retreating. She's escalating towards something final. She looked at Silas. We have to assume this is real. It is real, Silas said. His voice was very quiet. Then we need to set a watch on the barn, Naomi said. Not the pasture, the barn. Every night, armed. They set it that night. Perry on the first watch, Rook on the second, with Fletcher himself taking the third in the deep night hours when the cold was worst and the darkness most complete. Naomi set a lamp in the kitchen window and stayed awake with her boots on, and the locked chest open on the table beside her, the ledger inside, every document they had accumulated through these months of siege arranged in precise, careful order. The first night passed without incident, the second and third as well. On the fourth night, the barn burned. Naomi was awake. She had not truly slept in 4 days when she smelled the smoke. It came through the kitchen window as a thread of something wrong, and she was off her chair and through the door before the thought had fully completed in her mind. The cold hit her like a wall. The yard was dark except for the stars and the pale remains of a half moon, and for a fraction of a second she saw nothing wrong. Then she rounded the corner of the house, and the barn was orange from within, the fire already inside the structure rather than climbing the outside walls, which meant it had been set from the inside, which meant someone had gotten through the watch. She screamed, not in panic, in volume. Fire! Fire on the barn! Everyone out! Loud enough to carry to the bunkhouse, loud enough to wake the dead, as Clem would say later with the humorless accuracy of a man recounting a terrible night. Rook had been on watch and had been struck from behind. They would find him later, dazed and bleeding from a gash above his ear, on the ground behind the equipment shed where he'd been dragged. Perry was running from the bunkhouse within 30 seconds of Naomi's shout, then Dutch, then Clem, then Fletcher from the far end of the property where he'd been checking the perimeter, and Silas. Silas was already at the barn doors. The horses, he said, and it was not directed at anyone. It was the one thought overriding everything else. Silas, wait. Naomi reached for him. He went through the barn door. What followed was the worst 14 minutes of Naomi Mercer's life. The fire had started in the hay storage at the back of the barn and was spreading forward through the structure with the specific, terrifying speed of dry winter hay, meeting an accelerant, because there had been an accelerant, as they would confirm later, the smell of it distinct beneath the smoke. Silas went in and brought out the first 2 horses, then the third and fourth, handing them off to Dutch and Perry, who held them in the yard, wild-eyed and shaking. Then he went in again. Naomi stood in the freezing yard in her stocking feet, with the fire reflected in her eyes, and every part of her body locked in the specific agony of watching someone she cared about walk into fire and come back, and walk in again. He brought out 5 horses, then 6, then 7. On the 8th trip, the section of roof above the hay storage collapsed. The sound of it was enormous. A deep, structural groan followed by a crack like a rifle shot, and then the roar of the fire finding new oxygen. The barn doors blew outward with a gust of heated air and smoke, and Perry and Dutch jumped back, and Naomi's heart stopped. Silas came out through the doors 10 seconds later, moving fast but wrong. his right arm held at a strange angle against his body, his face dark with soot, the back of his shirt blackened. He made it 6 steps into the yard before his legs failed him, and he went down on one knee. Naomi was beside him before he hit the ground. "Let me see," she said, her voice completely level in the way that voices become level when panic turns over into something colder and more functional. She got her hands on his arm, and he made a sound she had never heard from him before, brief and controlled, but involuntary, the sound of serious pain escaping through a crack in an otherwise sealed exterior. Burns. The right forearm and hand, the back of his neck, a section of his right shoulder where the shirt had burned through. Significant. Not fatal, but significant, and needing treatment immediately. "I can walk," he said. "I know you can," she said, already supporting his weight. "Walk to the house." Fletcher took Silas's left side without being asked, and together they got him to the kitchen table. Naomi worked by lamplight with the medical kit she had organized in the pantry in October, the one she had reorganized and restocked in November after she'd understood what they were dealing with, and she cleaned the burns with the carbolic solution, applied the clean linen dressings with hands that did not shake, and did not allow herself to feel anything except the work. Silas sat through it without speaking, his good hand flat on the table, his jaw set in that way she knew. Outside, the barn burned down to its foundations. There was nothing to do but let it go and keep everything else wet. Perry and Dutch worked the water pump relay to keep the equipment shed and the bunkhouse damp while the barn consumed itself in the February dark. By dawn, the barn was gone. Naomi sat at the kitchen table across from Silas, with the lamp burning between them and the first gray light coming through the window, and she looked at the documented record in her ledger, and at the man across from her with his bandaged arm and his soot-marked face, and she felt something move through her that was not grief and was not rage, but was both of those things transmuted by something harder and colder into a kind of absolute clarity. "She has to be stopped," Naomi said. "Yes," said Silas. "The documentation we have is not enough on its own, circumstantial. The supply interference, the fence breaks, the cattle, we have records but no direct link to Ashcroft." She looked at him steadily. "We need a confession, or we need to catch the people who set this fire with enough evidence to make them give her up." Silas looked at her across the lamp. How? And here was where Naomi Mercer showed the full measure of what she was. Not just the woman who could hold a household and a community together through sustained pressure, but the woman who could think 3 moves ahead in the dark. "We let her think it worked," Naomi said. "The plan took a week to construct. Naomi drove it almost entirely herself, with Fletcher's assistance and Silas's agreement, and she built it with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything, the same quality of precise, patient, detail-oriented work that had reorganized the root cellar and repaired the bunkhouse roof and maintained the supply ledger through 4 months of deliberate interference. They began by letting specific information leak into Harlow Creek through channels they knew would carry it back to Evelyn Ashcroft. Fletcher mentioned casually at the feed store that the barn fire had been the final blow, that Iron Creek was in serious financial trouble, that Silas was talking about selling, that the winter losses and the destruction had simply been too much. Clem, at the saloon, let slip that Naomi was looking at returning to Caldwell Springs. Perry and Dutch, in separate conversations, expressed uncertainty about their own futures at the ranch. Every word of it was a lie, precisely calibrated. The next phase was the physical staging. The north pasture was cleared of visible cattle. The herd moved to a section of land behind the eastern tree line where it couldn't be seen from the road. The barn foundation was left untouched, giving the property the appearance of devastation and abandonment. The supply wagon was left unmaintained in the yard, small, visual signals of a place coming apart. And then they waited. Naomi explained the logic to Silas one evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table that had become, over these months, the strategic center of their entire operation. "She's been escalating because she's not sure it's working," Naomi said. "Now she'll hear it worked, and she'll want to confirm it herself. She'll send someone to look, not to do anything, just to see. And if what they see matches what she's been told, she'll move to the next step. A formal offer to buy the property at distressed price, quickly, before the story changes." She paused. "That offer will need to come from someone. That someone will need to come to this ranch. And if we've done this correctly, they won't come alone." "You think she'll send Decker?" Fletcher said. I think she'll send someone she trusts to close the deal, Naomi said, and I think that person will have information we need, either about the barn fire specifically or about the full scope of what she's been doing. She folded her hands on the table. We need that information in front of witnesses, credible witnesses. Judge Prentice, Silas said. Judge Prentice, Naomi confirmed. And 2 of the town council members, people whose presence at Iron Creek cannot be explained away. She looked at Silas. I'll invite them for an inspection of the property, a formal review of the fire damage for insurance purposes. Routine. Nothing suspicious. They'll be here in the house when the approach is made. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at his bandaged arm on the table between them. Then he looked at her with the full weight of those iron-gray eyes. If this goes wrong, he said, we lose everything. Whatever financial credibility we have left, gone. The men at risk, you at risk. If we do nothing, Naomi said quietly, we lose everything anyway, just slower. He held her gaze for a long time, then he nodded once. The trap was set on a Wednesday in late March. Judge Prentice, accompanied by 2 council members named Barnes and Lyle, arrived at Iron Creek Ranch at 10 in the morning for what had been described to them as a formal documentation of fire damage for insurance proceedings. Naomi had written the invitation herself in careful, legal language and had asked Fletcher to deliver it in person to ensure no misunderstanding. All 3 men were present in the parlor, the clean, restored parlor with the linen curtains and the polished floor, drinking coffee and reviewing the documentation Naomi had compiled when the horses came into the yard at 11:30. 3 of them. 2 men Naomi didn't know, and a third she recognized from the brief, chilling encounter in Harlow Creek 4 months prior. Garrett, the man who managed Ashcroft's north section, who had been seen with Decker at the saloon. He was the one who knocked. Naomi answered the door herself. Mrs. Boone, Garrett said, with the particular smooth confidence of a man who believes he is in a stronger position than he is. I represent Evelyn Ashcroft. I understand you and your husband have been reassessing your options here at Iron Creek. Mrs. Ashcroft has asked me to convey her continued interest in the property and to present a formal offer of purchase. Of course, Naomi said. Won't you come in? She led them into the parlor. The moment Garrett saw Judge Prentice, the smooth confidence cracked. Just slightly, just enough. Judge, he said. Garrett, Prentice said. He was a measured man, careful in the way of those whose profession requires precision. He looked at Naomi, then back at Garrett. Naomi sat down across from Garrett with her ledger on the table beside her and her hands folded and her dark eyes very calm and very direct. Before we discuss any offer, she said, I'd like to show you something. She opened the ledger. This is a documented record of every act of interference directed against Iron Creek Ranch beginning in October of last year. Supply manipulation, fence breaks, livestock theft and brand alteration. The employment of a man named Decker who was seen asking about the structural layout of our barn approximately 1 week before it burned to the ground. She turned the ledger to face him. I'd like you to look at the dates, the amounts, the witnesses, and the descriptions. And then I'd like you to tell Judge Prentice and these 2 gentlemen from the town council, who are here today specifically as witnesses, what you know about who directed and financed these actions. The parlor was very quiet. Garrett looked at the ledger. He looked at the judge. He looked at the 2 council members. He looked at Fletcher and Silas and Rook and Clem, who were positioned at various points in the room with the particular stillness of men who have been waiting for this moment for a long time. And then he looked at Naomi. She looked back at him without expression and without mercy. The younger of the 2 men with Garrett broke first. He was perhaps 25, and the weight of what he was sitting in the middle of was evidently more than he'd signed on for. He said, his voice unsteady, Mrs. Ashcroft paid for the barn. Decker was her man. She told Garrett what needed doing, and Garrett paid us. Shut your mouth, Garrett said, sharp and hard. He will not, said Judge Prentice, in the tone of a man whose authority in this room was now absolute and fully awake. He looked at the young man. You'll want to keep talking, son. Everything you say now will be a great deal better for you than anything that comes out later without your cooperation. The young man talked. He talked for a long time. He talked about the fence breaks and the cattle drive and the brand altering and the supply interference that Evelyn Ashcroft had coordinated through Garrett, and then he talked about the barn, who had been there, who had carried the accelerant, who had struck Rook from behind, who had struck the match. Garrett said nothing throughout. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and the particular expression of a man calculating how far his loyalty to his employer actually extended and finding the answer insufficient. In the end, it was Garrett himself who named Evelyn Ashcroft in connection with the arson. Not voluntarily and not heroically, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who has reached the bottom of what he is willing to absorb for someone else's ambition. "She told me she wanted it finished," he said. "The barn, the cattle, whatever it took. She said she'd been patient for 3 years and she was done being patient." Judge Prentice looked at Barnes and Lyle. They looked at him. The thing between them was unspoken, but mutual. "I'll need all 3 of you to remain available," Prentice said to Garrett and his men. He stood, and when he stood, the entire room stood with him. "This matter will be brought before the court." He turned to Naomi. "Mrs. Boone, the documentation you've compiled is available in its entirety," Naomi said. "I have a copy here and a second copy deposited with the postmaster in Caldwell Springs, sealed and dated as of 2 weeks ago." She had done this quietly and without mentioning it to anyone, even Fletcher, even Silas, a precaution against the possibility that the original might be destroyed. "You may take the original with you today." Prentice looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood exactly what he is dealing with. "Mrs. Boone," he said quietly, "you have been thorough." "I had to be," Naomi said simply. After they had gone, Garrett and his men, escorted by Fletcher and Rook with a clarity of purpose that left no room for alternative routes, the parlor emptied gradually until only Naomi and Silas remained. The afternoon light came through the linen curtains in long, quiet columns. The ledger sat on the table, its pages turned to the final entry. A date and a description and a list of witnesses, written in Naomi's careful hand. Silas sat in the chair across from her. His bandaged arm rested on the table. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, open in a way that she had not thought his face capable of, as though something that had been sealed very tightly for a very long time had finally given way under the particular sustained pressure of everything she was. "You knew," he said. "From the beginning, you knew this was going to end in a courtroom." "I knew it needed to end somewhere with evidence," she said. "A courtroom was the only ending that made it permanent." He was quiet for a long time. The afternoon settled around them. "Naomi," he said. "Yes," she said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He just looked at her across the table, with the ledger between them and the winter light falling through the curtains his wife had once chosen, in the house that Naomi had brought back to life from neglect and grief and 2 years of slow decline. "Thank you," he said. And this time when he said it, it was entirely different from the 11-minute Wednesday in the judge's office. It carried the full weight of every month behind it, every hard morning, every repaired thing, every meal, every night watch, every documented entry, every decision made with the ranch's survival as the fixed and unwavering point. Naomi looked at him across all of it. "This is worth protecting," she said, returning his words back to him. Outside, March wind moved across the Iron Creek property, across the yard where the burned barn's foundation still showed dark against the pale earth, across the north pasture where the consolidated herd had come back to graze, across the fence line that had been broken and repaired and broken and repaired and now stood straight in the cold afternoon light. The trap had closed. The evidence was out of her hands and in the hands of the law. Evelyn Ashcroft, on 6,000 acres of Ashcroft land to the north and east, did not yet know what was coming for her. But it was coming. Naomi Mercer, Naomi Boone, folded her hands on the table and let herself, for just a moment, feel the full and solid weight of what had been built here against every force that had tried to prevent it. It held. The arrest of Evelyn Ashcroft did not happen quietly. Nothing about Evelyn Ashcroft had ever happened quietly. Not her land acquisitions, not her social campaigns, not the 4-month siege she had directed against Iron Creek Ranch from behind the polished facade of respectability. So it was perhaps fitting that her arrest, on a Thursday morning in the first week of April, occurred on the main street of Harlow Creek, in full view of the general store and the post office, and the saloon and every person who happened to be conducting their ordinary business on that ordinary morning when Judge Prentice's deputy arrived at the Ashcroft Land Company office with a warrant and the particular expression of a man carrying the full authority of the law. Naomi was not there to see it. She heard about it from Fletcher, who had been in town for feed supplies and had witnessed the entire thing from the boardwalk outside Tibbs's store with the expression of a man watching something he had waited a long time to see. She came out of that office like she expected the world to rearrange itself around her, Fletcher told her that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. Looked at the deputy like he was something she'd stepped in. Said she'd have his position before the week was out. He paused. He turned his cup in his hands. Then she looked up the street and saw how many people were watching, and something went out of her, just went out. He was quiet for a moment. I almost felt something for her. Almost. Naomi said nothing. She set a plate in front of him and went back to the stove. The formal hearing was set for the 3rd week of April in the county seat of Mill Haven, a larger town 30 miles from Harlow Creek, with a proper courthouse and a district judge named Calloway, who had a reputation for neither sentiment nor corruption, which was precisely what this case required. Naomi had been informed by Judge Prentice that her testimony would be central to the proceedings. The ledger she had compiled, every date, every loss, every witness, the documented progression from supply interference to arson, would be entered into evidence. Prentice had told her this in the measured professional language of a man who deals in facts, but at the end of the conversation he had paused and said carefully, "Mrs. Boone, I want you to understand that Mrs. Ashcroft has retained considerable legal representation. The attempt will be made to discredit both the documentation and its author. You should be prepared for that." "I have been prepared for that since November," Naomi said. Prentice had looked at her in that way he had, the way of a man recalibrating, and nodded. The weeks between the arrest and the hearing were unlike anything that had preceded them on Iron Creek Ranch. The external pressure, the accumulated siege of the preceding months, lifted with a suddenness that was almost disorienting, like a sustained physical weight removed all at once, leaving the body uncertain how to hold itself without it. The supply orders from Tibbs came correct and prompt. The feed store restored credit terms without being asked. The damaged fences that remained unrepaired from February were mended by a crew Silas hired from Mill Haven, working quickly in the April thaw. And the town of Harlow Creek, which had spent 4 months in the careful, social pressure-managed posture of a community that does not look directly at uncomfortable things, began, tentatively and then with increasing directness, to look. The first indication came when Mabel Norris, the wife of the blacksmith, and one of the women Naomi had seen most often at the periphery of the social campaigns against her, appeared at Iron Creek Ranch on a Tuesday morning with a covered dish and an expression of profound personal discomfort. She stood at the kitchen door and held out the dish, a preserved fruitcake made from last summer's peaches, and said, without preamble, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Boone. I repeated things I should have verified. I'm sorry for it." Naomi took the dish and stepped back to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. Mabel Norris talked about how thoroughly Evelyn Ashcroft had managed the social information of the town, who heard what, when, through whom, and how easy it had been to carry a version of a story without examining its source. She was not excusing herself. She was a practical woman who understood that understanding how she'd been wrong was the only way to avoid being wrong the same way again. "She told people you were nobody," Mabel said. "No family, no history, no one to vouch for you. And people believed it because it was easier than finding out the truth." "The truth was there to find," Naomi said without heat. "I know," Mabel said. "That's the part I can't forgive myself for. It was there, and we didn't look." She looked at her hands. "We looked away because Evelyn Ashcroft buys things from our husbands and attends our social events and makes it very costly to be in her disfavor." She looked up. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not, but I want you to know that I know it." Other apologies followed in various forms. Some were more articulate than Mabel's, some considerably less so. Gerald Tibbs appeared one afternoon and spent 10 painful minutes explaining his position and his regret with the halting sincerity of a man who has spent considerable time composing what he wants to say and is not confident he's gotten it right. Naomi listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, present, precise, without either warmth or coldness. She didn't absolve anyone. She didn't perform graciousness. She didn't feel. But she didn't punish either. She simply received what was offered and moved forward. Silas watched this from the margins. He watched people come to the door of his kitchen and sit across from his wife and emerge looking lighter than when they'd entered, and he did not have a word for what she was doing, but he understood its effect. She was giving people a path back. Not an easy path and not a free one. She was requiring them to look directly at what they had done, but a path that existed, which was more than most people in her position would have offered. One evening in the second week of April, when the kitchen was quiet and the ranch had gone to its nighttime rhythms, and they sat at the table with the lamp between them, Silas said, "You're not angry." Naomi looked at him. "I'm angry," she said. "You don't act angry." "Acting angry doesn't change anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been angry since November, probably before that. But anger is only useful when you can aim it at something that will break under it. Most things don't break under anger. They just wait until it burns out, and then they're still there." She looked at the lamp. "I needed what I was carrying to last longer than my anger, so I put it somewhere else." Silas looked at her across the table for a long time. "Where?" he asked. "Into the ledger," she said simply. "Into the roof and the root cellar and the supply schedule and the watch rotation and the trap." She met his eyes. "Every time I was angry, I built something instead." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's—" He started and stopped and started again. "I've never met anyone who does that." "It's not a gift," she said. "It's just the only thing I found that worked." He looked at her with the full weight of whatever had been building in him since the barn fire, since the kitchen table in January, since the horse barn in Comet, and the first morning she'd fixed the stove. It was an expression she had learned to recognize and had not yet allowed herself to respond to directly, because there were things that needed resolving before anything between them could be defined by anything other than partnership and necessity. The trial was one of those things. They drove to Millhaven on a Wednesday morning, Naomi and Silas together in the supply wagon, Fletcher following in his own rig. Perry and Dutch had offered to come, and Naomi had told them no. Someone needed to stay with the ranch, and she didn't want the spectacle of arriving at a courthouse with a contingent. Clem had nodded approvingly at this decision. Rook had said nothing, which she had long since learned meant agreement. Millhaven was 4 times the size of Harlow Creek, with a proper main street and a courthouse built from pale sandstone that sat at the end of it like a statement of intent. On the morning of the hearing, it had the particular charged quality of a public event. People she didn't recognize clustered on the courthouse steps, a cluster of ranchers and merchants from the surrounding territory who had their own complicated histories with the Ashcroft Land Company and had come to see how this resolved. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different, formal. The air of a room where what is said will be written down and held. Evelyn Ashcroft sat at the defendant's table with her legal counsel on one side and a composure that Naomi had to concede privately was genuinely formidable. She was in black, as though she had already determined the appropriate costume for the occasion, and she held herself with the particular rigid dignity of someone who has built an identity entirely around the performance of authority and will not relinquish that performance even here. She did not look at Naomi when she entered the room. Naomi sat beside Silas in the gallery and looked at Evelyn Ashcroft with the steady, measuring regard she had first directed at the condition of the kitchen on her first day at Iron Creek Ranch, clear-eyed, thorough, finding no purchase for fear or sentiment. The hearing ran through the full day and into the following morning. Garrett testified first. He had struck a cooperation agreement, and he honored it with the exhausted thoroughness of a man who has decided to be completely done with something. He laid out the full structure of the operation, how Evelyn had directed the campaign through him, who had been hired for what specific task, how payments had been made, how instructions had been communicated. He described the barn fire in operational detail that was almost clinical in its precision, and he named Decker as the arsonist, and he confirmed that Decker had been compensated in advance from Ashcroft accounts. The young man, whose name Naomi learned was Holt, no relation to Fletcher, corroborated everything and added the detail that Evelyn Ashcroft had personally reviewed the layout of Iron Creek Ranch from maps provided by Garrett, and had personally directed that the barn be targeted rather than the house, because livestock loss was more financially devastating than property damage, and she had wanted the blow to be a financial one. Evelyn's counsel was aggressive and precise. He attacked Garrett's credibility as a man testifying under a cooperation agreement. He attacked young Holt's testimony as coerced, He presented Evelyn Ashcroft as a legitimate businesswoman who had made lawful offers to purchase a neighboring property and was being scapegoated for problems of the ranch's own making. It was competent lawyering, Naomi thought. Under different circumstances, against a less complete record, it might have been sufficient. Then they called Naomi to the stand. She walked from the gallery to the witness stand with the same deliberate, unhurried quality she brought to everything. Not performing confidence, simply exercising the real thing. She sat down. She was sworn in. She looked at the district judge, at Evelyn Ashcroft's counsel, at the gallery that had filled completely by mid-morning with people standing along the back wall, and she felt nothing frightening. Only the same clarity that had carried her through the barn fire and the January kitchen and the first morning at Iron Creek when she'd looked at a neglected and dying house and felt not despair but the particular private satisfaction of a woman who knows how to fix things. She answered every question in the same voice she used at the kitchen table, clear, unhurried, precise. She walked the court through the ledger chronologically, entry by entry, connecting dates and incidents to the pattern that emerged from them. She described the supply interference and the conversation with Tibbs. She described the fence breaks and the cattle theft and the brand alterations. She described Clem's report about Decker and the saloon meetings with Garrett. She described the construction of the trap and the meeting in the parlor with Judge Prentice and the council members, and what Garrett's man had said, and what Garrett himself had finally said. She said all of it without drama, without performance, in the voice of a woman who has been building this record for 5 months and knows it completely. Evelyn's counsel came at her during cross-examination with the specific technique of a man who wants to establish that a witness is motivated by personal grievance rather than fact. He asked about the circumstances of her arrival at Iron Creek, her lack of formal references, her movement from place to place before Caldwell Springs. He asked about the marriage, using the word convenient in a tone that was designed to activate the earlier narrative that Naomi had no legitimate stake in the ranch and no legitimate identity within it. Naomi answered every question without raising her voice or changing her expression. "You arrived at Iron Creek Ranch with no verifiable references," counsel said. "I arrived with a letter from the Caldwell Springs Employment Office," she said. "The office's records are available. Gerald Tibbs, the store owner in Harlow Creek, can confirm that I placed consistent professional supply orders for 6 months. The ranch hands at Iron Creek can speak to the quality of the work I performed there. Fletcher Holt, the foreman, recommended me for the position. I have never misrepresented who I am." "You married Silas Boone after only 2 months at his ranch," counsel said, with the particular emphasis that was meant to imply something unsavory. "I married Silas Boone," Naomi said, "when it became clear that Mrs. Ashcroft was using the ambiguity of my social position as a vehicle for slander, which she was then using to turn the town against the ranch commercially. The marriage was a legal response to a legal vulnerability. The timing was dictated by Mrs. Ashcroft's actions, not by any other consideration." She paused. "You're welcome to subpoena her correspondence on the matter." A sound moved through the gallery. Not laughter. Something more like the specific collective exhale of a room full of people who have been watching something very carefully and have just seen it resolve. Counsel changed direction. He tried once more, from a different angle, to suggest that the ledger was a retrospective construction rather than a contemporaneous record. Naomi directed him to the postmaster's stamp on the sealed copy she had deposited in Caldwell Springs, dated 6 weeks before the hearing, when she had sent it without telling anyone, which established that the documentation had existed in its complete form before any legal proceedings had been initiated. Counsel had nothing after that. When Naomi stepped down from the witness stand and walked back through the gallery, she passed a woman she recognized, the heavy-set woman in the good wool coat who had stood on the Harlow Creek boardwalk in November and said she won't last. They never do. The woman looked at her as she passed, and something in her expression had changed so completely from that November boardwalk that they might have been 2 different people. There was no contempt in it now, no calculating assessment, just the simple, unguarded expression of a person who has witnessed something they did not expect to witness and has been changed by it. Naomi did not stop. She sat down beside Silas, who said nothing, but whose hand, resting on the bench between them, had moved just slightly closer to hers. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Evelyn Ashcroft was found guilty on 7 counts, including property destruction, livestock theft, criminal conspiracy, and arson resulting in injury. The last count the most serious, given Silas's burns. Her counsel immediately announced an intent to appeal, but the appeal would take months and the verdict was entered and the room understood what it meant. When the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom was very quiet for a long moment. Then a sound began in the gallery. Not the sudden noise of a crowd, but something more like a tide. A slow collective release that grew from the back of the room forward. People who had spent 4 months in the managed silence of a community under social pressure, who had looked away from things they should have looked at, who had let rumors stand in place of investigation. Those people were exhaling something they had been holding for a long time. Judge Calloway sentenced Evelyn Ashcroft to 18 months in the Territorial Corrections Facility and a financial penalty that would take a significant portion of her land holdings to satisfy. The Ashcroft Land Company, he noted in the sentencing statement, had obtained several of its recent acquisitions through methods that would now be subject to review. Naomi sat through the sentencing with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed and still, and felt the thing she had been waiting to feel for 5 months. Not triumph, which would have been too small and too loud for what this actually was. Something larger and quieter. The particular feeling of a weight set down after a long carry. The feeling of ground held. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the April afternoon, something happened that Naomi had not anticipated and could not entirely account for. People came to her, not the way they had come to the kitchen door of Iron Creek with their apologies and their covered dishes. That had been private, individual, calibrated. This was different. This was public, in the pale spring sunlight on the courthouse steps, with the full town watching. Mabel Norris was there, Gerald Tibbs, several ranchers from the surrounding territory who had their own histories with Ashcroft pressure and had watched Naomi's case with the specific attention of people who understood exactly what was at stake. One older woman, a widow, Naomi would learn later, who had sold her property to the Ashcroft Land Company under exactly the kind of social pressure the trial had just documented, pressed Naomi's hand in both of hers and said nothing at all, just looked at her with an expression that said everything. Barnes and Lyle, the 2 council members who had been present in the Iron Creek parlor on the day the trap closed, spoke publicly on the courthouse steps about what they had witnessed that day, the ledger, the documentation, the evidence of a sustained and deliberate campaign. Barnes said, in the plain, direct manner of a man unused to speeches, "What Mrs. Boone did here, the way she built the case, maintained the ranch, protected the people on it while all this was being done against her, that's not something you see often. That's something worth knowing about." Naomi stood in the April sunlight and received all of this with the same quality she brought to everything. Present, without performance, finding no words large enough and therefore using none. It was Silas who finally said quietly beside her, "We should head back. Ranch doesn't run itself." She looked at him. His arm, still bandaged under his coat sleeve, held at the careful angle of a healing injury. His iron-gray eyes in the afternoon light. The line of his jaw, less sealed than it had been on the day she arrived, than it had been on the day in the barn with Comet, than it had been on the January evening in the kitchen. Less sealed each time, the pressure equalizing in the direction of something she had not let herself name directly and was running out of reasons not to. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They walked together to the wagon. On the 30-mile drive back to Iron Creek Ranch through the April afternoon, through the greening prairie and the sky that had opened wide and pale blue above the flat land, they were quiet for a long time. Not the watchful, careful quiet of the early months. The other kind. The kind that doesn't need to fill itself. After a long while, Silas said, "What you said in there, about building things instead of burning with anger." He was looking at the road ahead. "I've been doing the opposite, for 2 years. Since Margaret—" He stopped. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name directly to her. "Since she died. I've been sealed up, like Fletcher said, like a jar somebody tightened too hard." He paused. "I've been angry for 2 years and building nothing." Naomi looked at the road. "You built the ranch," she said. "You kept it. You didn't sell it even when she made it very costly not to." "That was stubbornness," he said, "not building." "Sometimes stubbornness is what building looks like from the outside," she said. He turned and looked at her. The wagon moved through the spring afternoon. The horses knew the way home. "Naomi," he said. She turned and met his eyes. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with everything behind it. Every month, every repaired thing, every watch rotation, every documented entry, the barn fire and the parlor curtains, and the sealed jar of Margaret's grief beginning, at last, to open. "I know this started as a practical arrangement," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to renegotiate the terms." She looked at him for a long moment. The road stretched ahead of them toward Iron Creek Ranch, toward the burned barn foundation that would need rebuilding, toward the kitchen with the stove she had properly blacked, and the parlor with the linen curtains and the ledger that had held the record of everything they had survived. "I'd consider that," she said. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something that started in his eyes and worked its way, slowly, to the rest of him. Something that belonged to a man who has been sealed up for 2 years and has just felt the seal give way. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on Silas Boone. She turned back to the road ahead. The April sky was very wide. The prairie was turning green at its roots. Iron Creek Ranch lay 30 miles ahead of them, waiting, holding itself together, as it had learned to do, through the particular discipline of people who understood that what is worth protecting must be tended every single day, and that the tending itself is not a burden, but the very substance of a life worth living. Naomi Mercer, Naomi Boone, held the reins loosely in her hands and let the horses find their own pace toward home. Behind them, in Millhaven, the court recorded its verdict. Ahead, the community that had spent a winter looking away was turning, slowly, and with the particular self-consciousness of those reconsidering, back toward the light. And the woman who had arrived at a dying ranch with a worn leather bag and nowhere else to go had become, without intending it and without announcing it, the fixed point around which something larger had quietly organized itself. The barn went up in 6 days. Not the same barn. Better. Silas had drawn the plans himself over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, and Naomi had looked them over with the same careful eyes she brought to supply ledgers and watch rotations, and had suggested 3 modifications: a wider center aisle for easier cattle movement during winter, a secondary hay storage loft with its own access ladder on the north wall so that a fire in one storage section couldn't travel as rapidly to the other, and a proper ventilation system along the roof ridge that would reduce the heat accumulation that made barn fires so catastrophic once started. Silas had looked at her modifications for a long moment and then, without comment, redrawn the plans to incorporate all 3. What neither of them had anticipated was the help. The morning the lumber arrived from Millhaven, ordered and paid for, the financial recovery beginning in the careful, methodical way that Naomi had already begun planning during the weeks before the trial, Fletcher came to find Naomi in the kitchen with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "There are wagons on the road," he said. She went to the front porch and looked out across the yard to the iron gate at the property's edge. And there were wagons. 4 of them initially, then 6, coming up the road from the direction of Harlow Creek, with men on the seats and tools visible in the beds. She recognized Gerald Tibbs on the second wagon. Mabel Norris's husband, the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Howard, was driving the third. 2 of the ranchers she had seen on the courthouse steps in Millhaven were on the fourth. Behind them, on foot, walking in the particular unhurried way of a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it, came Clem's brother, a man named August who ran a small farm 6 miles east and whom Naomi had met exactly once at the hearing. He was carrying a box of tools. Perry appeared beside her on the porch. "What is this?" he said. "I don't entirely know," Naomi said. What it was, it turned out, was a barn raising. No one had organized it formally. No meeting had been called, no announcement made. It had assembled itself the way things sometimes assemble in communities that have been through a shared reckoning, through conversations at the feed store and the saloon and the general store counter, through the specific social mechanism of people who feel they owe something and are looking for a concrete way to pay it. Howard Norris had apparently said to someone at some point that it was a damn shame about the Boone barn and that someone with the right skills ought to do something about it, and the comment had moved through Harlow Creek like water finding its level until it had turned, without particular leadership, into 14 men showing up on a Monday morning with tools and lumber and the practical intention of doing something useful. Silas stood in the yard as the wagons came through the gate and watched with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that was not quite any of the words Naomi had for what she was seeing. She watched him shake Howard Norris's hand, a long, firm handshake with the quality of two men acknowledging something between them that doesn't require language, and then move down the line of arrivals with the same quality of acknowledgement, and she understood that what she was watching was a community repairing something in itself as much as something on the ranch. She went back to the kitchen. There were 14 men to feed. By the end of the first day, the frame was up. By the end of the third day, the walls and the secondary loft. By the end of the sixth day, the roof was on. The ventilation ridge was seated. The wide center aisle was floored with packed earth and edged with fresh-cut timber. And the new barn stood on the Iron Creek property in the May morning light, larger than the one before it, better designed, built by hands that belonged to a community that was not entirely sure how it had arrived here, but understood, with the particular collective intelligence of people who have survived a winter of bad choices, that it needed to be here. On the last evening, when the work was done and Naomi had fed everyone twice over from a kitchen running at its absolute full capacity, she had drafted Perry and Dutch as kitchen help for 3 days, which they accepted with the resigned grace of men who understood they had no choice. The group of builders sat in the yard in the late spring evening with their suppers, and there was the specific quality of ease that comes from a large thing completed together. Howard Norris sat near Silas and said, without looking at him, "We should have been paying better attention to what was being done to you." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're here now," he said. It was, Naomi thought from the kitchen doorway where she stood with a dish towel in her hands, the most generous thing she had ever heard him say. The summer that followed was the first one in Iron Creek's memory that felt like growth rather than survival. With the barn rebuilt and the herd consolidated and healthy, Silas turned his attention to the eastern boundary, the section of land that abutted what had been Ashcroft territory, but was now in legal limbo while Evelyn's assets were reviewed by the territorial courts. There was a possibility, Fletcher had learned from Judge Prentice, that portions of the eastern acreage might become available, and Silas was quietly, carefully positioning the ranch to be in a position to acquire a section of it if the opportunity arose. Not out of ambition for its own sake, but because the creek access that ran through that eastern section would make Iron Creek's water security for the herd entirely independent of any future neighboring property's goodwill. It was the kind of thinking Naomi recognized, not reactive, but structural, planning the ranch not for what it needed now, but for what it would need to remain strong in 10 years. She recognized it because it was the same kind of thinking she applied to everything. In June, the preserves business began. It had started almost accidentally, in the previous autumn, when Naomi had put up an excess of preserved fruit and vegetables against the winter uncertainty, and found, by January, that she had more than the ranch could use. She had traded some of it to Tibbs' store in lieu of payment on a supply order, and Tibbs had sold it to customers who had come back asking for more. She had noted this and filed it away, as she filed everything, and through the siege winter she had continued putting up preserves as much because the work steadied her as for any commercial intention. But in June, with this crisis resolved and the ranch stabilizing, she looked at the still room she had organized off the kitchen, the shelves of canned goods, the crocks of preserved vegetables, the jars of fruit preserves and pickled things. And she looked at her kitchen ledger, which tracked costs and outputs the way Fletcher's ledger tracked cattle and finance, and she did the calculation that she had been doing in the back of her mind since January without fully acknowledging it. She presented it to Silas at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in the straightforward, documented way she presented everything. "The preserves from last winter generated $12 in trade credit at Tibbs," she said. "That was from excess production while I was managing the household on reduced supply. If I expand the operation deliberately, additional crocks, a second still room, a consistent supply arrangement with 2 or 3 stores in the territory, I'm looking at a sustainable secondary income for the ranch." She paused. "And more than that, there are women in Harlow Creek and in the settlements east of here who have the same skills and no commercial outlet for them. If I coordinate production, pay them for their output, standardize the quality, sell under a single arrangement, it becomes larger than what one kitchen can do." Silas looked at the figures she had laid out on the table. He looked at her. "You've been planning this since winter," he said. "Since January," she confirmed, "while the ranch was under siege." "It was useful to have something to plan," she said. He looked at her for that long, revising moment, the the one she had learned to read as him updating his understanding of what she was, which apparently required periodic updating even now. Then he looked back at the figures. "What do you need?" he said. A second still room. The small outbuilding behind the kitchen could be converted, and an arrangement with Tibbs and the Millhaven dry goods store for consistent purchase orders. She paused. "And permission to approach 3 women I have in mind in Harlow Creek, and 2 in the eastern settlements about participating." "You have my permission for all of it," Silas said. "You don't need to ask." "I know I don't legally need to," she said. "I'm asking because this is your ranch and your resources and your name on the arrangement, and I think decisions made together hold better than decisions made alone." He looked at her with an expression that by now she knew very well, the one that lived in his eyes, and hadn't yet, in all the months since the April drive back from Millhaven, made it the rest of the way to words. Something in the quality of that evening's kitchen, with the summer dark outside, and the lamp warm between them, and the preserved fruit in jars on the still-room shelf catching the light through the doorway, was different. The sealed thing in him had been opening incrementally for months. The January kitchen, the courthouse drive, the renegotiated terms he had proposed on the wagon seat, and whatever the remaining distance was, it closed now. "Naomi," he said. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At saying things. Margaret used to say I communicated primarily in weather and fence repairs." Something moved in his face at the name. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but the particular tenderness that grief leaves behind when it has been properly attended to. "But I want to say it clearly, since I seem to have started." He looked at his hands, then at her. "What you did here, what you've done since October, it isn't something I can repay or calculate or put in a ledger. You didn't just save this ranch. He stopped, tried again. "I was sealed up, like I said on the drive back, and you didn't try to open me. You just were here, every day, building things, and eventually the pressure equalized." He looked at her with everything in it. "I love you. I didn't expect to, but I do, and I want you to know it said plainly and not in weather and fence repairs." The kitchen was very quiet. Naomi looked at him across the table for a long moment, at the man who had opened the door on her first day with complete indifference and had become, through the long chemistry of shared work and shared survival, the person she trusted most completely in the world. She felt the thing she had refused to name directly since the 5th week on the ranch, the fragile unnamed thing she had been protecting from too much attention for too long, and she let it be named. "I know you do," she said quietly. "I've known for a while." She paused. "I love you too, Silas. I have for longer than is probably sensible given our history." He looked at her. "Our history," he said, "is 5 months of siege warfare followed by a barn raising." "It's more than that," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." He reached across the table, and his hand, the one that had healed from the burns through the winter and the spring, marked now with the particular smooth scar tissue of a recovered injury, covered hers on the table between the lamp and the ledger and the figures for the preserves business. They sat like that in the kitchen in the June evening, and it was not a dramatic moment by any external measure. There was no audience and no announcement. There was just the kitchen that Naomi had rebuilt from chaos, and the lamp she had tended, and the window through which the summer dark of the Iron Creek property was visible, the barn, solid and new, standing where the burned one had been. All of it theirs. All of it earned. The preserves operation was established by August. Naomi had converted the outbuilding herself, with help from Perry, who had developed over the months a kind of uncomplicated personal devotion to Naomi's projects that manifested as showing up with tools whenever something needed building. The second still room was clean, organized, and ventilated in a way the original kitchen still room was not, which improved the quality of the output measurably. She had approached, with characteristic directness, 5 women about participating in the production arrangement. 2 were in Harlow Creek, Mabel Norris, whose preserved fruit Naomi had tasted at the kitchen table and found genuinely excellent, and a younger woman named Clara Webb, who had 3 children and a farm that wasn't producing enough to cover winter. 2 were in the eastern settlements, sisters named Voss, who had been putting up preserves for years with no commercial outlet, and 1 was a woman in Mill Haven, a widow named Patience Hale, who operated a small kitchen garden and had the kind of methodical precision in food preservation that Naomi recognized as a professional skill being exercised without professional compensation. She sat with each of them individually and presented the arrangement in the same plain, documented way she presented everything: production quotas, quality standards, pricing, payment terms. No charity, no condescension. A business proposition between people with complementary capabilities. Every one of them said yes. By the time the first coordinated supply order went to Tibbs's store and to the Millhaven dry goods operation in September, the output was 40% larger than anything Naomi could have produced from a single kitchen. By October, Tibbs had doubled his order. By November, a merchant in the county seat had heard about the operation through the Millhaven store and had sent a letter of inquiry. Naomi wrote back in her careful hand and arranged a meeting. Fletcher watched all of this with the expression of a man who was not surprised by anything that happened at Iron Creek Ranch anymore, but was still regularly impressed. He said to Silas one evening, over post-supper coffee on the porch in the October cool, "You understand what she's building, don't you? It's not just preserves." "I know," Silas said. "She's creating a reason for women across this territory to have a cash income that doesn't depend on their husband's operation surviving a bad year." Fletcher looked out at the yard. "She's changing what's possible out here." "I know," Silas said again. And there was a quality in his voice that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but the deeper thing that comes from watching someone you love be fully themselves in the world without diminishment. "I told her. She said it was just good business." "It is good business," Fletcher said. "That's what makes it remarkable." Rook, who was sitting at the far end of the porch in his customary silence, said, "She always was the smartest one here," and then, as though he had used his monthly allocation of words, said nothing further. The autumn passed in the full productive rhythm of a ranch operating at genuine strength for the first time in years. The herd was healthy and well-fed going into winter. The hay stores were deep. The kitchen pantry and the still room were stocked against cold with the systematic thoroughness that Naomi had brought to every supply problem she'd ever faced. The ranch hands, Perry and Dutch and Clem and Rook, who had been at Iron Creek for years before Naomi arrived and would, she understood, stay as long as Iron Creek stood, moved through their work with a quality of investment that was different from mere employment. Fletcher managed the operation with the same steady competence he always had, but with less of the anxious watchfulness of a foreman who is not sure whether the structure above him will hold. It held. It held in the way that things hold when they have been properly built by people who understand what they are building and why. On a cold evening in late November, exactly 1 year after the night Naomi had driven back from Harlow Creek with the correctly filled supply order and the first understanding of what Evelyn Ashcroft intended, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the Iron Creek property in the dark. The barn was lit from within, Perry doing the late feeding, his lantern visible through the new ventilation louvers along the roof ridge. The bunkhouse windows were bright and warm. The equipment shed stood straight and solid. The chicken coop was no longer tilted at its precarious angle. Dutch had quietly rebuilt it in September as a personal project, saying nothing about it to anyone until Naomi noticed it one morning and looked at him with an expression that apparently satisfied whatever response he'd been hoping for. Behind her in the kitchen, she could hear Silas moving through the hallway from the study she had never entered, which had remained the one sealed room and which Silas had opened one afternoon in July and invited her into. She had walked in and found it a room full of ledgers and maps, and on the desk, a framed photograph of a woman with a composed, clear-eyed face who might in some other life have been her contemporary. She had stood in the room for a moment, and Silas had stood beside her, and nothing had been said because nothing had needed to be, and they had walked back out together, and she had taken his hand in the hallway and held it for a moment, and that had been that. He came into the kitchen now and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the property together in the dark. "Clem's talking about staying through another winter," Silas said. "Clem's been talking about leaving every winter since I arrived," Naomi said. "He's still here." "He'll die here," Silas said. "He knows it. He's fine with it." She turned and looked at him. "Are you? Am I fine with Clem dying here? Are you fine with this?" she said, a gesture that took in the kitchen, the window, the property beyond it, the whole sustained, surviving, growing enterprise of Iron Creek Ranch and the life built inside it. "A year ago this place was dying. Now it's—" She paused. "I want to know if you're fine with what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. His face, in the kitchen lamp, was the face she had been reading for a year. Iron gray eyes, jaw that was no longer granite set, but simply the natural line of a man at ease in his own house. The sealed quality was gone. In its place was something she had no single word for, but recognized as the particular texture of a person who has come back to themselves after a long time away. "I'm better than fine," he said. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him in the cold kitchen. Outside, Perry's lantern moved in the barn. The prairie beyond the fence line lay dark and wide and open under a sky brilliant with winter stars. "I've been thinking about the eastern acreage," she said. "I know you have," he said. "Fletcher told me about the inquiry from the territorial court. The review should be finished by spring. If even a quarter of it becomes available, the creek access," he said. "I know." He paused. "I've been thinking about building a proper office, off the study, somewhere you can run the preserves operation without doing your bookkeeping on the kitchen table." She looked at him. "I don't mind the kitchen table." "I know," he said, "but you deserve a proper office." She was quiet for a moment. "You're building things again," she said. "I have good company," he said. She reached for his hand without looking. Found it the way you find a familiar thing in the dark, without searching, simply by knowing where it is. His fingers closed around hers. They stood at the kitchen window in the November dark, and the year that had been built, brick by brick, repair by repair, document by document, meal by meal, watch rotation by watch rotation, every small and large act of endurance and intelligence and refusal to be driven out, lay behind them and around them and ahead of them in ways that were not yet finished being shaped. The woman who had arrived in October with a worn leather bag and nowhere else to go, and the quiet fire of someone who knows how to fix things. She stood in the kitchen of her own house, on the land she had helped save, beside the man she had chosen and who had chosen her back, and she was exactly where she intended to be. Not by luck, not by grace, by the particular hard-won, irreducible quality of showing up every single day and doing the work that needed doing, whether anyone was watching or not. Years later, when the preserves operation had grown to supply merchants across 4 counties, and the women who participated in it had enough of their own income to weather bad harvests and bad years without losing everything, people in the territory would try to identify the moment when things had changed. The moment when it had become understood that a woman's capability was not determined by where she'd come from or who vouched for her or what the social consensus had decided she was worth. They would point to the trial, or to the barn raising, or to the kitchen at Iron Creek that had gone from a disaster of neglect to the operational heart of one of the territory's most respected ranches. But Naomi, when anyone was direct enough to ask her directly, would say none of those things. She would say, "It started with the stove." She would say, "The first morning I got the stove cleaned and properly stoked and the first batch of biscuits came out right. I understood that this place could be made into something. And I decided I was going to be the one to do it. Everything else," she would say, "followed from that." The Iron Creek Ranch stood for a long time after that, through dry years and hard winters and the slow transformation of the territory around it. The barn that 14 men built in 6 days was still standing decades later, with the ventilation ridge Naomi had specified, and the secondary loft that made the difference when, in a dry summer 3 years on, a lantern accident in the hay started a fire that was contained before it could spread, because the design did not allow it to spread, because a woman who had once watched a barn burn had thought carefully about how fire moves and built the knowledge into the structure itself. The ledger the one she had kept through the siege winter, every entry in her careful hand, the document that had built the case that had broken Evelyn Ashcroft's campaign and her power, Naomi kept in the same locked chest in her room, even after her room became their room, even after the chest was moved to the proper office Silas built off the study in the spring following the trial. She kept it not out of pride or as a monument to what had been survived, but because she understood what it represented. The proof that the careful, patient, thorough documentation of truth is a more powerful instrument than money or social influence, or the coordinated force of someone who wants you to disappear. In the end, what it proved was simple. She had been here, she had done the work, and she had kept the record. Those 3 things, taken together, were not beatable. Fletcher retired in the summer 3 years after the trial, At an age he refused to specify precisely, and moved into a small house in Harlow Creek, where he raised a kitchen garden and came out to the ranch for supper more evenings than not, because the kitchen at Iron Creek was still the best table in the territory, and because, he said to Mabel Norris at some point, he was constitutionally incapable of staying away from a place where things were properly run. Clem stayed until he couldn't, and then he stayed a little longer than that, and when he finally went, it was in his sleep in the bunkhouse on a winter night so cold the stars seemed closer than usual, and the whole ranch felt his absence in the way you feel the absence of something that has been so constant you had forgotten it was a choice. Rook stayed. Rook had always been going to stay. He had known it. In the wordless, settled way Rook knew things, from the morning he had installed the well handle and walked away without acknowledgement. He stayed and worked the ranch with the same undemonstrative excellence he had always brought to it, and every year in the autumn, when the new hands arrived, because the ranch grew, and growing ranches need hands, he taught them what they needed to know in the fewest possible words, and pointed them, by example and without explanation, toward the standard that Iron Creek held itself to. Perry married Clara Webb in the spring following the trial. Clara Webb, who had joined the preserves operation and was paying her own bills for the first time in her adult life. And they built a house on the eastern acreage that had, as Naomi had calculated, become available through the Ashcroft Asset Review. They were good neighbors. Dutch stayed unmarried and seemingly untroubled by it, and became over the years the finest hand with cattle that anyone in the territory had seen, which was a source of satisfaction to him that required no supplementation. And Naomi and Silas Boone, who had begun as employer and employee, and become partners, and become a married couple, and become, through the long and serious and sometimes devastating work of a year of siege and survival, something that had no precise word but was the specific thing that two people become when they have seen each other at the full extent of what they are, and have chosen each other anyway, built their life on Iron Creek Ranch in the way that good things are built, steadily, carefully, with attention to the foundation, to the structure, to the small repairs that prevent large failures, with the understanding that what is worth protecting must be tended every day, and that the tending is not a burden but the substance itself. The woman who had arrived with nothing and nowhere else to go had built everything she needed out of the place and the people she had found there. She had arrived a stranger. She left nothing, because she never left, and Iron Creek was hers in every way that mattered, and she was its, and that was the whole of the story and the whole of the truth. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. End.